What happened on the Senate floor this week represents something we have not seen in nearly a decade of Trump-era Republican politics. Republican senators broke ranks, not one or two moderates who always break ranks, not a symbolic protest vote on a bill that was going to pass anyway. This was a substantive, consequential vote on war powers, and enough Republicans crossed the aisle to send a message that cannot be ignored. I am going to break down exactly what happened, why it matters, what it reveals about fractures within the Republican coalition, and what it signals about the balance of power between the executive branch and Congress. This is not speculation. This is documented floor votes, public statements, and the constitutional principles at stake. If you want to understand why this vote is significant and what it means for American foreign policy, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel for analysis that goes deeper than headlines. Let's get into it. First, let me establish the facts of what occurred, because the details matter. The vote in question was on a War Powers Resolution, a legislative mechanism rooted in the War Powers Act of 1973. That law, passed in the aftermath of Vietnam over President Nixon's veto, requires the president to consult with Congress before committing U.S. forces to hostilities and to withdraw forces within 90 days unless Congress authorizes continued military action. War powers resolutions have become one of the primary tools Congress uses to push back against executive military action. They are privileged resolutions, meaning they cannot be blocked by leadership and must receive floor votes. In recent years, we have seen several war powers votes that crossed party lines. In 2018 and 2019, the Senate voted on resolutions to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. Republican Senators Mike Lee of Utah, Rand Paul of Kentucky, and others joined Democrats. The resolution passed the Senate 56-41 in March 2019, with 7 Republicans voting yes. In January 2020, after the strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, the Senate passed a war powers resolution aimed at limiting further military action against Iran without congressional approval. That vote was 55-45, with 8 Republicans joining all Democrats. Those 8 Republicans were Mike Lee, Rand Paul, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Jerry Moran, Lamar Alexander, Todd Young, and Bill Cassidy. The pattern is instructive. War powers votes consistently attract a small but meaningful group of Republicans who prioritize congressional authority over executive deference. The current vote follows this pattern, but with some notable additions to the coalition. And those additions are what make this moment significant. When senators who have been reliable Trump allies begin voting to constrain executive military authority, it signals something beyond individual conscience. It signals a calculation that the political ground has shifted. Let me explain why. To understand why war powers votes matter, you need to understand the constitutional architecture they are trying to protect. Article I, Section 8 of the Constitution grants Congress the power to declare war. This was not an accident. The founders, drawing on their experience with King George III, were deeply suspicious of concentrated executive power, particularly the power to commit a nation to armed conflict. James Madison wrote in 1793, "The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly with studied care vested the question of war in the legislature." For most of American history, this principle was respected, at least formally. Congress declared war against Britain in 1812, against Mexico in 1846, against Spain in 1898, and in both world wars. But the 20th century saw a dramatic shift. Korea was fought under a United Nations resolution, not a congressional declaration. Vietnam escalated through the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which Congress later regretted. And the post-9/11 era saw the authorization for use of military force, passed in 2001, stretched to justify military action in countries and against groups that did not exist when the authorization was written. The War Powers Act was supposed to restore congressional authority, but in practice, presidents of both parties have largely ignored or circumvented it. They commit forces, claim the 60-day clock has not started, argue the action does not constitute hostilities, or simply dare Congress to cut off funding for troops already deployed. This creates a pattern that constitutional scholars call executive aggrandizement. Each president inherits expanded powers from their predecessor and expands them further, while Congress, polarized and deferential to presidents of their own party, fails to push back. War powers votes are the exception. They are one of the few mechanisms where Congress actually asserts its constitutional role. And here is why Republican votes matter so much. When Republicans vote to constrain a Democratic president's military authority, can be dismissed as partisan. When Democrats vote to constrain a Republican president, same dynamic. But when Republicans vote to constrain a Republican president, they are putting institutional principle above partisan loyalty. They are saying that congressional war powers matter regardless of who occupies the White House. That is rare, that is significant, and that is what happened this week. Now let me analyze the political forces that led to this vote. Because the constitutional principles alone do not explain why senators vote the way they do. There are three overlapping factors driving Republican defections on war powers. Senators like Rand Paul and Mike Lee come from the libertarian wing of the Republican Party. They are consistent skeptics of military intervention regardless of which party controls the White House. Rand Paul voted against military action in Syria under Obama, opposed intervention in Libya, and has consistently argued for a restrained foreign policy. Mike Lee wrote a book called Our Lost Constitution that specifically criticizes executive overreach on war powers. For these senators, the vote is ideologically consistent. They are not defying Trump specifically. They are defending a principle they have championed for years. Republican senators face competitive re-election races. Polling consistently shows that voters, including Republican voters, are skeptical of foreign entanglements. A 2023 Pew Research survey found that 42% of Republicans believe the U.S. should be less involved in global affairs, from 36% in 2019. War weariness after 2 decades of conflict in the Middle East has reshaped public opinion across the political spectrum. For senators in swing states, voting to constrain military action can be politically advantageous. It distances them from potential quagmires. It appeals to constituents tired of endless wars, and it gives them an independent credential they can cite on the campaign trail. Some senators, particularly those who have served for decades, maintain loyalty to the Senate as an institution. They remember when the body had more independent authority. They resent executive encroachment regardless of party. Mitch McConnell, for all his partisan maneuvering, has occasionally defended Senate prerogatives against presidents of his own party. Institutional memory matters. Senators who plan to remain in the body long after any particular president is gone have different incentives than those whose identity is entirely wrapped up in the current administration. These three factors, ideology, electoral calculation, and institutional loyalty, combine differently for each senator who votes to constrain executive war powers, but together they create a coalition that crosses the usual partisan lines. To understand what happens next, you need to understand how Trump typically responds to Republican defections. The pattern is well documented. When Republicans oppose Trump on significant votes, he responds with public attacks designed to create political costs for defiance. We saw this with Mitt Romney after the first impeachment vote. Trump called him a failed presidential candidate and a disgrace. Romney was censured by the Utah Republican Party. He was booed at state conventions. The message to other Republicans was clear: cross the president and face the consequences. We saw it with Liz Cheney, who went from third-ranking House Republican to expelled from leadership to defeated in her primary after voting for impeachment and serving on the January 6th committee. We saw it with Bill Cassidy, who voted to convict in the second impeachment trial. Trump endorsed a primary challenger. Cassidy has spent years trying to navigate the political fallout. The strategy is deliberate. By making examples of defectors, Trump creates a deterrent effect. Other Republicans calculate that the cost of opposition exceeds the cost of compliance, even when compliance means abandoning positions they might privately hold. But here is what is different about war powers votes. They are substantive enough to attract serious-minded senators, but not personal enough to trigger the full Trump retribution machinery. Voting against executive war powers is not the same as voting for impeachment. It does not carry the same personal implications. It is easier for senators to frame as principled constitutional conservatism rather than personal betrayal. This gives Republicans more room to defect. They can argue they are protecting the Constitution, defending congressional authority, preventing executive overreach, all conservative principles with long pedigrees. Whether that framing protects them from political consequences remains to be seen. Trump has shown a willingness to attack Republicans for any perceived disloyalty. But war powers votes have historically generated less retribution than impeachment or election-related votes. Let me step back and analyze what this vote reveals about the current state of the Republican Party. The Republican Party under Trump has often appeared to be in lockstep. But war powers votes reveal that the coalition contains genuine disagreements on foreign policy. The libertarian wing, represented by Paul and Lee, has never been comfortable with hawkish intervention. The traditional conservative wing, represented by institutionalists who remember the Reagan era, maintains commitments to congressional authority. The Trump-aligned wing, focused on loyalty to the president above all, views any defection as betrayal. These factions coexist uneasily. Most of the time, party discipline holds. But on specific issues, particularly war powers, the seams become visible. Critics have argued that Congress has become a rubber stamp, incapable of checking executive power. War powers votes complicate that narrative. The votes may not always succeed in changing policy. Presidents can veto war powers resolutions. Courts have generally avoided enforcing the War Powers Act. But the symbolic and political significance of these votes should not be dismissed. When Congress asserts its constitutional role, even symbolically, it establishes a marker. It creates a record. It signals to future Congresses that the power exists and can be exercised. Senators facing competitive races are more likely to assert independence. This is not cynicism. It is how representative democracy is supposed to work. Elected officials respond to their constituents. When constituents signal that they are tired of military adventurism, senators from competitive states respond by voting to constrain executive war powers. This is representation functioning as designed. The question is whether this electoral pressure is strong enough to overcome the countervailing pressure from Trump and his loyal base. In safe Republican states, defying Trump is dangerous. In swing states, defying the median voter is dangerous. Different senators face different calculations. The House Republican caucus has become significantly more Trump-aligned than the Senate Republican caucus. This is partly structural. House districts can be gerrymandered to create safe seats for ideologically extreme candidates. While senators must win statewide, war powers votes highlight this divide. The Senate consistently produces more bipartisan coalitions on these issues than the House. This creates tension within the Republican conference and complicates legislative strategy.